Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the C-Vision International CISO Thought Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Igor Volovich, formerly the CISO of Invensys and Schneider Electric Americas, and currently the founder and chief strategist at Cyber Partners. Today, it is our privilege to welcome a very special guest, a lifelong cybersecurity practitioner, recognized industry expert, and currently the Chief Information Security Officer for the U.S. intelligence community, Mr. Matt Connor. In his current role, Mr. Connor is responsible for protecting our nation's most sensitive information and defending our intelligence community against the most sophisticated and determined cyberspace adversaries. On today's episode, we'll focus on some of the unique challenges of leading such complex and multifaceted security organizations and share some of the hard-learned lessons with our leadership community to help them build and mature their own security organizations. Without further ado, let's welcome to our program, Mr. Matt Connor.
Thanks, Igor. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Matt. So obviously, cybersecurity is a very technical domain, and yet despite our highest level of global security investment, cyber breaches continue to make headlines. Clearly, there's something our industry keeps getting wrong, and if it's not technology, then what is it? Which I think is a perfect segue to the topic of human factors, and especially as it pertains to the domain of security and security leadership. And I think it's a good time to ask the first question. What are your thoughts on the role that human factors play in cybersecurity and cyber leadership, and how do we improve our ability to create better outcomes?
That's a great question. I mean, I think ultimately we have to remember that every cybersecurity program ultimately comes down to people. There's no shortage of investment in a very rich market at this time. I think that we've seen trends over time of CISO budgets growing with additional investment from boards. Obviously, with that comes additional requirement for ROI demonstration or outcome-based demonstration. But ultimately, every program is people. And I think some of the areas where we could absolutely grow is in the areas of diversity and inclusion within the cybersecurity discipline. I think for a long time, cybersecurity has looked too homogenous. And I think that we're missing out on rich voices that can be part of that conversation. I know that at my agencies or at the D&I and at the agencies that I worked at previously, we're working hard to diversify our workforce and make sure that there are other voices within the conversations in cyber. And we do that in a multitude of ways, but I know it is a passion of our program to represent a varied workforce.
That's fantastic. That's great to hear. You know, I think we've seen a progression from ensuring that we had enough diverse voices at the table to now making sure that they actually get a chance to speak, encouraging them to speak. And I think, that's not without its challenges, of course, and making sure we invest in development early on in someone's career. That's very important. And I think we focus so much on the technical skills and the technical acumen that sometimes it happens to the exclusion of more of the softer skills, right? And I'd love to hear your perspective on that too. We tend to view security as a very technical domain, of course, but how do we enable those other skills to develop early on? How do we identify talent, the potential future leaders within this industry and specifically within our organizations that might bring something else to the mix, right? Might have a different opinion, a different way to contribute.
Absolutely. I think that comes in multiple ways, right? I mean, I think we need to change the way we both recruit and retain talent. I think we need to change the way we empower our workforce. I think we need to change the way we mentor and grow our personnel. I know from some of our agencies within the intelligence community, there's a very focused intent on recruiting from traditionally underserved areas or perhaps areas without significant investment and outreach. These could be things like, Gallaudet University or HBCUs or multiple programs within the federal government, even the Cyber Corps and Scholarship for Service programs, where we're looking for people who don't come out of the traditional cybersecurity programs from some of the classic programs that we're familiar with, and I think that makes us all the richer and all the better for that. And then we look at, once we recruit this talent, we have a challenge retaining talent. It's obviously a very competitive market. Industry can typically outcompensate the United States government, but the government has plenty of benefits that are quite discriminating, from healthcare, from investment in travel and training and conference attendance and the tools, and of course, most importantly to me, the mission that our agencies have to protect America's interests, foreign and domestic. I go to work most days, and I know this sounds corny, but I leave fulfilled knowing what I'm doing is helping decision makers, lawmakers, and people in camouflage get home tonight. I mean, you can't, there's no substitute for that. And so I think that when we talk about growing our workforce, I think we have to look at what role we play, you play, I play as a leader in that process. I know that I need to put myself out there for mentoring. I need to put myself out there for questions. I frequently engage people about how to get into this field, how to grow in this field, career paths. And I love what you said about sort of diversifying the talent, diversifying the skills that people bring to the mix. There's no substitute for technical acumen. It's necessary. This is a technical discipline and it moves very, very quickly. But my experience has been, my observation has been that there are lots of factors that make someone successful. Every team needs a mix of people who are very, very comfortable living in the ones and zeros, living in the flags and the payloads. And every team also needs people who can translate that to mission or business outcomes, who can talk about that with laypersons and communicate jargon into real world speak. I mean, I think of my role as the CISO, and I'm sure yours has been the same, is to translate, a translation matrix really is to translate that technical wonky detail from sensors, from telemetry into what does this mean? What does it mean to my mission? What does it mean to my business? What can I do? And the role of cybersecurity is to enable and extend that mission or that business objective, et cetera. So I think that when we look at who do we need in our cyber programs, I think we have to think a little bit bigger than just the forensics, just the malware reverse engineer. I think there are lots of other skills that make people successful. The United States government, of course, is heavy into the governance and compliance, right? That's a real role that the government plays, a lot of audit, those kinds of things. And so we look very broadly at who we can bring into these programs, who we can grow. And there's nothing more satisfying as an active mentor to see people take on different roles, different challenges, and become more effective, more well-rounded, growing from wherever they began into whoever we know that they can be.
Making investments in talent, it always pays off, right? And I think one of the challenges is how do we get enough people in the door even today? Because as you said, you have unique challenges because of course you work for the US government and some folks don't view that as a great career path sometimes, except, your mission is bar none. I mean, there's nobody else who's doing what you're doing today. I mean, I can go to work and worry about spreadsheets and making the quarter and making sure that our compliance is on point, but ultimately, I go to sleep at night and I don't worry about somebody, like I said, in camouflage halfway across the world, whose mission might be impacted and whose very life is at stake based on what you do or fail to do, right? So I think that binds folks together. I think it creates a better esprit de corps, right? It creates a better team where everybody's pulling together and understands the mission. And I think a lot of the churn that we see within this industry, a lot of the folks kind of, transitioning from within their career path from one job to the next, the typical churn of being 18 to 24 months, even at the leadership echelon, doesn't leave a lot of room for that longevity, for that long-term tenure where you can really build a team, create a culture, live within that culture and improve that culture over time. So how do we create incentives that bring people together, keep them there, keep them in the roles, and continue to improve and grow as a career professional, where we give them opportunities that they may have not even thought about, but really play to their best skills or maybe best aptitudes they haven't even explored.
The government is very, very conscious of the acute dearth of cybersecurity talent and the vast number of unfilled cyber jobs. I've seen, national estimates in the millions. I've seen local estimates in the tens of thousands. I know the Cyberspace Solarium Commission identified, I think, up to 40,000 unfilled cyber jobs. It's a tough market out there. It's obviously a very growth market. The good news, the luxury problem that we have is that every industry now seeks cybersecurity professionals to protect their mission, whatever that is, whether that's a industrial controls, whether that's a construction company. I've talked to the CISO of manufacturing companies and casinos, right? The cyber is everywhere now. What a great problem to have. The government is trying to pull every lever it can to bring those people into our ecosystem. I mentioned before the Scholarship for Service and Cyber Corps programs. I'm a huge fan. Annual job fairs, obviously suspended during COVID, but a chance for people, young students to get an opportunity, the government to invest in their education and support their financial goals with their education, well, for a chance to serve the government for a couple of years. And some of the very best people that I've seen in the government cybersecurity programs come out of those scholarship for service cyber core programs. And they're coming out of, the Syracuses and the Penn States and, some of the HBCUs as well, which is fantastic. So I think those are the ways that we're trying to bring people in. OPM's got a number of programs now. That's the Office of Personnel Management. Jargon. OPM's got programs now to incentivize cybersecurity hiring, recognizing how challenging it is to fill these spaces. We've got lots of levers available in terms of additional salaries above the government pay scale, retention and incentive bonuses for people. I mentioned before how much we invest in growing our own. I mean, that's a dawning realization that in many cases we're growing our own cybersecurity workforce, whether that's the analytics cyber mission, the defensive mission, the governance risk and compliance mission. In many cases, we're doing in-house training and growth to develop those people because we just simply can't find them all. And so it's a very challenging environment, but like you said, I think we're offering a very rich mission. I think culture is everything, right? So I mean, there's all kinds of cliched sayings about culture eating strategy for breakfast, but I do believe that as a leader, tone starts at the top, and we've got to create an environment that gives those people the opportunities they're seeking. These people coming out of college, they want a chance to play with advanced technology. They want to be heard. Like anybody else, they want to be heard. And so I think it's really important, the way we lead our programs, the way we lead our offices is to create that culture where their voice is valued, where they get a chance to contribute and they get a chance to own something. I mentor a number of people informally and formally, and nothing that I do makes me feel happier each day than seeing someone grow, not what I want them to be, what they want them to be. And so that's how I begin my mentoring engagements with them and talking about, what are your goals? What can I do for you? What excuse me, what do you see that you want to be, and if that path is, I want to learn cyber so I can get here, learn cyber so I can get there, I support that too. And some of my mentors are not actually in the cybersecurity field, and that's incredibly rewarding. So I think it all comes down to the teams that we build, how we empower them, how we make them accountable, right? That's real too. But how we make sure their voice is heard. And that's why that diversity and richness of thought, diversity and richness of background is so important. If we take the same people and put them in the room, we're going to get the same thing. And Einstein remarked that, the thinking that created these problems won't solve it. So the more we can bring in different perspectives, empower them, and then listen to them, I think we're far the better for it.
Well, that there's a lot of insight there, of course. And you mentioned strategy, you mentioned talent development, and culture, of course, right? Culture is strategy. We all know that. We've learned that a long time ago, and I think we've all lived it. What I'm curious about is when you talk about kind of creating not so much a series of answers for your mentees, but really asking a lot of questions and letting them figure out where they might find a path in cybersecurity. And maybe it may not necessarily lie in cybersecurity ultimately, but you're trying to engage them in sort of this precision questioning narrative, we could call it that, right? Asking the good questions, open-ended questions that leave them to make their own choices. So how do we do that as leaders? There's a recent study that was done by Harvard Business School, and they published it in the HBR, where they talked about leadership being about asking questions, questions being kind of quintessential leadership skill, part of the leadership acumen. And a lot of leaders don't feel comfortable. They feel that they need to be vulnerable in order to ask questions. And they don't trust that they'll be seen in the right light, especially in a very technical domain like cybersecurity, where you're kind of supposed to know everything. So I think there's this cultural idea of a myth, if you will, of a be-all, end-all, know-all, see-all CISO who's got deep domain expertise within a number of things, probably all things within cyber is the expectation. And what we see in the talent marketplace, there's this notion of a kind of a hands-on CISO, a practitioner CISO, a playing coach, if you will. And I think that's taken away from some of the expectations that we've had within the leadership echelon, that we would grow into a lot more leadership type qualities, attain a lot more of those leadership skills, and ultimately really make our way into the C-suite. We have a lot of conversations about that. Folks keep sort of harping about the fact that, well, CISOs don't necessarily operate within the C-suite. We have the titles, but a lot of them happen to be courtesy titles. The C might be silent, the O might be silent. And basically we're kind of technology managers, a little glorified perhaps. So how do we as leaders trust ourselves trust our culture, trust our organization, to be vulnerable, to ask those kinds of questions, and to create sort of this open-ended learning environment where we can all band together and be comfortable not knowing the answer, and instead figuring out what the question should be.
I think part of that is I think we've created our own myths about this invulnerable, whether you call it on a pedestal or not, this invulnerable, omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing cyber weenie. And I think that's dangerous, right? I think that's dangerous to us. I think that's rooted in pride and hubris on behalf of those who held those titles. I think it begins with small steps. It begins with teams, with leaders, with whomever, being willing to take that risk and put yourself out there and say, I don't know, or what do you think? I mean, I love, there's books and theories and themes on more exquisite questions and those kinds of things. I love that kind of stuff. Nothing makes me more fulfilled than pulling a team together and saying, what do you guys think? Right? I'm the decider. That's my role. But I want to hear from everybody. I want to hear what people think. I love a good brainstorming session. What do you think? And I think it's setting aside that pride and taking a risk that people recognize it's unreasonable for one person to know everything. I similarly, I enjoy the HBR, and there's a good piece of research, and perhaps I like it because it's confirmation bias, and perhaps I like it because it's empirically true. But I think the most effective leaders build teams of people who, as a complement to one another, can answer all those questions or can explore all those questions. And so I like this research because it talks about leaders historically needing to be a master of all things. That's a historical perspective, and a growing perspective that a leader in any discipline needs to surround themselves by smart people, and not to feel obligated to master every single sub-discipline within their domain, but instead have a team that's capable of responding to that. I really, really like that idea. There are areas of cybersecurity or program management or leadership that I'm not as effective in as I am in others. And what's important to me is to build a team that complements that fills in those gaps and brings their expertise to that. And again, you think about what it takes to set that pride aside and say, let me bring my bring my finance person in here, and she's going to explain to you why, how this works. I'm making something up. The point being, I'm much more comfortable in a team that can as a team together answer those kinds of questions. I love questions. If my team were on this call, they would all lament the amount of questions that I ask, and some are sort of deliberate Socratic kinds of questions of like, let's lead us down a path to this, and some are like, I don't know. I do know I am very keen to try things. I very much subscribe to the MVP theory. I very much I emphasize, dot ones versus version 1.0, whether that be a policy, whether that be a guidance instrument, whether that be an initiative, a program, a capability, et cetera. Very keen to work our way and learn our way through those kinds of things. I think that perfect's the enemy of progress. And I know that that's important to our teams. Creating a culture where it's okay to fail is another incredibly key value, where you're supported, where the answer to, hey, can we try, is almost always yes. Right. I mean, if there's a good reason, running afoul of the law, running afoul of policy, we'll work through that. But can we try? Yes, let's try. That's important to me. I'm always I lament if we always do what we always did, we always get what we always got. And so I love trying new things.
Especially in an organization like yours, where failure can be disastrous. You're still trying to figure out a way to try to do the MVP, the minimal viable product, within your context, which must be fascinating. Of course, we won't touch that on this call, but it's curious to know that small failures keep big failures away, right? And the sooner you can fail fast, fail small. And if you can do that consistently and create the culture where that's possible, where people feel comfortable doing that, where you're not going to get knocked out and penalized for a failure, that's very important. It's hard to do. It's sort of counterintuitive. We operate in this 0-1 binary world. It's either right or it's wrong. It's math, right? And it's interesting that the way you progress in this environment, right, in this field, is by being very precise, being very good, being very technical. And when you're wrong, the industry tries to sort of throw you out. And how do we change that perception, right? How do we make it possible for folks to make the transition from being sort of very precise, very binary, very technical, and start adding those other softer skills. And at what point do we start doing that for our mentees, for the folks who report to us, for the folks within our organization, maybe even our peers? How do we make that possible? I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think you said something very important at the beginning there, which is the context, right? So I think as a leader, you have to understand your environment well enough to know where you can take calculated risks and where you can't. We can't take some risks. I mean, there are just some things that are inviolate, whether they're mission essential functions, something that we would call a mission essential function, whether it's life safety, et cetera. There are some places where we can't take risks, or we take very small risks, and our risk appetite is reflective of that. But there are places where we can take calculated risks. And I talked to a CIO once at a former agency who told me once, we were talking about this very challenge of incentivizing failure. How do we do that, especially within the government, right? He's like, I want people to take the $40,000 risk. I can't have people taking the $40 million risk, right? Now, that's a spectrum. That's obviously a continuum there. But I think it comes down to understanding the environment and understanding the consequences, understanding the impacts of taking those risks. I'm fond of saying we can take calculated risks. The trick is we have to calculate them. And I don't think people always do that risk algebra, right? They don't do that risk management algebra where they calculate, the classic formula that arrives at like, what's the impact if we do this or don't? I think a lot of that's kind of gut. And I think that we have to be more deliberate. It doesn't mean slow. It doesn't mean onerous. It can be agile, but it has to be deliberate to calculate risks and determine where you can accept that and where you can't. And that should guide how we authorize our projects, how we invest our dollars, right? How we invest our very scarce time and resources. I think that comes down to context, and I think there's kind of no substitute for that experience in a specific operating context. Time takes time, like they say, and so it takes a little bit of familiarity with the program to decide, we'll try it over here, but we can't over there.
I've got a saying that I'm fond of. The more you do it, the easier it gets. And a friend of mine and my trusted colleague that I've worked with for a long time, he loves saying that, and we've said it many times with clients and with each other. The more you do something, the easier it definitely gets, and the more you allow people to do these little small failures, like I said, $40,000 failure is okay, 40 million not okay. How do you put those 40,000 failures together in a way that people can actually learn from them? And the one way to do it is to have total transparency, right? Which may be a challenge in your environment, right? Right, and very classified and very compartmentalized. But within the kind of the commercial private industry context, there's absolutely no reason why security needs to be obscure. There's absolutely no reason why it needs to be some dark art that we practice in dark rooms, in front of green screens and never see the light of day. And I'm reminded of a case when I was at Microsoft. We actually had our pen test team operating exactly that way. They were in dark rooms, red lights, very obscure, very dark art, ninja by the night kind of thing. And they took on a new leader whose first order of the day was, let's stop that. Clean offices, bright rooms, open doors, no mystery mongering for its own sake. We need to compartmentalize what we need to compartmentalize, but by and large, the learning opportunities, we need to make that transparent. And I thought that was really interesting. In this space, it's very easy for us to say, oh, well, this is very classified, it's very secret, even in places where that's not necessary, right? So that's sort of this, again, part of that myth creation and mystery mongering machine. But how do we transition past that, right? How do we enable people to learn from one another? And I think transparency is the way, right? But also encouragement from leadership. Like I said, everything starts from the top. If you don't have a requirement to do that, if you don't have that expectation, if you don't build those incentives throughout the entire organization, I mean, from the earliest, the lowest analyst that you might have taken on 6 months ago, all the way to the CISO, him or herself, you have to have that as part of the culture dimension, right? And if you don't have that, how do you build that, right? If you were to walk into an organization today that didn't have that as part of their culture, how would you start building it?
Well, I mean, I think you described it when you talked about your colleague whose very first step was to open up the lights, right? I mean, sunlight's a disinfectant. I have always bristled at this group is very special UC. This group is, sort of these elite hacksaws, and they get the low lights and the six-headed monitors, and they, and we're okay with them going. Going to a test event or something in less than professional attire, whatever that is for the context. I'm very resistant to the the allowances that are made, for those kinds of things, because I think that creates a priesthood, what I call an arcane priesthood. I detest that. I've been very proud of, in previous teams that I've led, like those folks literally have open house days. They literally have brown bags where they're sharing their skills, they're doing demos. We recognize in the federal government October Cybersecurity Awareness Month, that's a good time for, so to pull the curtain back and expose some of that stuff. I mean, because especially that you're talking about pen test teams. I mean, that's dead sexy, right? So, I mean, people love pen testing. And when you talk to a group of young people coming into the profession, what's on their mind? Want to hack some boxes, right? So I think it's important to demystify that, to democratize that. And I think it starts with the very first steps that you described, which is like, okay, let's integrate you with the team. Everybody can benefit from that cross-pollination. And so whether that's one team or a team of teams, something unique about the role of Director of National Intelligence, the office that I support, is the orchestration function for the rest of these 18 intelligence community elements. And so we're talking about, many of the agencies you see in the press, and my role is to bring them together and support them in what I often call a love connection. And what I love to do is to find out that one of the agencies is facing a challenge that one of the other agencies has solved, and putting those together and everybody bonusing from that work is incredibly important. My peers across the intelligence community, the leads cyber CISOs for the other agencies, we talk as often as we possibly can, through instant message, through emails, and of course we're the government, through meetings. We have both formal and informal structures for cross pollinations, discussion groups, agenda items, briefings, both to people, and then of course conversations with people. And you talk about compartmentalization, you talk about security. Those are real. There are some things that, for reasons to protect sources and methods, that cannot be disclosed to others. By and large, we like to say one team, one fight. We're defending America's intelligence apparatus from adversaries, wherever they might be, and however level of sophistication they have. And so we share a lot. There are sharing policies, there are sharing laws, but just in practice, we want what each other has. It makes us all better. And so we do that in formal mechanisms, informal mechanisms, from sensors and telemetry and instrumentation to conversations about various project efficacy. We share a lot, and I think that's the long-term outcome of things like the 9/11 Commission identifying that 20 years ago we weren't great at talking to each other. Now I think the agencies should be very proud of how much we share with each other. Again, one team, one fight. That's something you can rally behind.
This brings up a good question. What do you think is the value of including the private industry in the fight and creating better private-public partnerships? Of course, there's InfraGard and ISACs, and those have been somewhat effective. But I think one of the feedbacks that I've heard, certainly being out on the road and talking to fellow leaders and folks who are practicing in the industry, trying to enable those partnerships can be tough. It can be seen as a one-way street, right? You share a lot of knowledge back to the agencies, but you frequently don't hear back. You might have a good start to a good investigation. You want to hear what happens after. So how do we create better partnership where it's truly a two-way street, where maybe some of that learning and some of the sharing that is possible to be done, that it actually happens, right? And one of the models that I'm interested in is something that let's say Estonia is doing. The Cyber National Guard model, where you actually have volunteers who are fully qualified, ready to go, willing and able to commit their time for the defense of their nation. Except there isn't a model for it today in the U.S. It doesn't seem to be one. I'm curious what you think about might be the next development in that domain.
Well, I mean, couple things there. I mean, the direct answer to the question you just posed is I don't know. I don't know what the evolution of that model on something like the scale of the U.S. And I've been to Estonia. It's a modestly sized country, right? And so I don't know how something like that would work at the U.S. I do know that we are very, very conscious of where we can improve information sharing and bidirectional communication with our industry partners. They are often the early warning systems for all kinds of important information, whether that be the beginnings of an attack, whether that be the irreplaceable role that industry plays in operating our defense, government, and intelligence apparatus, right? We talk about the defense industrial base and think about how many programs, how many companies are out there supporting delivering capabilities so that the IC, DoD, and the government can do what it does. So we're very conscious that the information sharing needs to increase. I think there are very real challenges that need to be worked through. I'm sensitive to the reporting and then not hearing back, from an investigative organization. I'm also conscious that you can't mess around with law enforcement activities and prosecutorial process, and so there are very real sensitivities or guidance or strictures that we have to operate within. I can tell you from the inside that everybody wants to share everything we can possibly share. Figuring out what that is and with whom. I mean, also on the industry side, there are very real concerns about privacy. There are very real concerns about legal. There are very real concerns about U.S. persons information. And so there's a lot for us to work on collectively with industry to get information sharing right. I think you'll see a continued push from the government. You see, if you're familiar with the Cyberspace Solarium report, identifies some of those information sharing challenges. The backdrop of the recent high-profile events with SolarWinds, obviously, and Exchange and others. We recognize the government, both government and industry need to come together to do more to overcome those obstacles that are stopping us from sharing everything. We rely on our sector-specific agencies. We rely on our ISACs. We rely on InfraGard, but we know we can do more.
And I know a lot of folks in the industry would love to help more, and certainly there are great partnerships already in place. But I think there's always room to do more and to contribute more. And I know a lot of folks would definitely be willing to do that if they were given a model to operate within.
You do see a little bit of this. People are surprised sometimes when intelligence agency representatives show up at big conferences and present things. And believe it or not, we're proud of that when we can present something that everyone can benefit from. And obviously, there are processes we have to go through for public affairs and protecting sources, methods, and such. But I mean, those are some of the small ways that we try to get back to industry on a very technical level. But at the big level, I mean, we're working through a lot of those policy and legal challenges.
Well, I don't think we'd have a good podcast if I didn't ask you the ultimate question. What do you think makes an effective cybersecurity leader, a true strategist, someone who's capable of orchestrating? You mentioned orchestration, right? And I think that's one of the quintessential skills of a leader, especially in this space. How do you do that? How do you become an effective leader, and how do you make sure that you are one and continue to be one and continue to develop and grow as a leader within this space?
I think what's most important for my role is that translation matrix that I described before. My job, I lead a cybersecurity program. I think of my job as extending an enabling mission, not cybersecurity for cybersecurity's sake, but I mean, I'm here to ensure that we can do more, collect more, defend more, protect more. And so I begin each engagement, each risk management conversation with a key eye on the mission outcome. And I think that's the role of every cybersecurity leader, whether you're in industry and you're focused on business objectives. I think you can't lose sight of that hill, that we're here to do a job, to do a mission, and cybersecurity is a supporting element for that. So translating what the teams and what the sensors and what the telemetry can tell us into outcomes that decision makers and policy makers and leaders can understand is my key function, I believe. When I'm talking to CIOs, when I'm talking to agency leaders, they need to understand it in their language, not the arcane priesthood, the black art, that what we do in a dark room with a sacrifice chicken at midnight. They need to understand in mission terms. That's what I think is the key role. And so from that perspective, what I often advise my mentees is get as close as you can to operations. I think of operations in my world as sort of mission, whether that's collection or defense, those kinds of things, but get as close as you can to the mission. If you can't externalize that deep technical knowledge to someone who doesn't know it, I think it blunts your value. And so that's how I tend to grow people.
It sounds like, despite the fact that there is no business value within your world, right? There is no quarterly result, there is no annual report. The business value concept is still very near and dear to what you do, and understanding where the value is being generated within the organization, where the mission, the core mission requirements are. How do you support them? How do you enable them? How do you embed security throughout your business DNA, if you want to call it that, right? And make that really a part of your operational matrix. That's very important. And that's not any different from any other environment, including the commercial space. And so that's interesting to hear, that the challenges may be different, but on the whole, they're not all that different when it comes to actual leadership challenges. How do you build cultures? How do you create teams? And how do you create better outcomes long term? Right? Because ultimately, it does come down to people, and it does come down to culture.
There's analogs to everything you just described in the, in our world. We build partnerships with allies. We build partnerships with internal agencies. We build partnership with industry. We are in a global competition, right? So we are in a global competition with near peer adversaries. We never lose sight of that. And so the outcomes that we're looking at are, America's assured superiority in all the multiple domains in which we operate. That's our role.
Big thank you to Matt Connor, the CISO of the U.S. intelligence community, for being with us today. And thank you to our audience for joining us for another episode of the CVision International Cyber Thought Leadership Podcast series. We'll see you again soon.